whole new section. And if you will just turn to page 4 for a second. I'll just kind of do a quick review here to remind you of this. So I broke it down into colors so you can see it. Chapter 11, verse 2 to chapter 12, verse 4 divides into two major divisions. Chapter 11, 2 through 35 deals with near fulfillment, predicting what is now history. In our time, it's history, but minute detail from Darius to Antiochus. In other words, it was prophecy when Daniel gave it, but now we see it as history. And that's what we're going to deal with tonight. And I don't know if we'll get through it all tonight. The next section deals with verse 36 through 12:4 and covers a far fulfillment just before the coming of Christ, or what we know as the Great Tribulation. And then chapter 12, 5 through 13, is a final message in Revelation that is given to Daniel. So tonight, we are going to begin our journey through chapter 11, verses 2 through chapter 12, verse 4. And as our tradition is, when we come to a new passage of word, we always read it together first. Kind of like you go up in the helicopter and take a good look at it, and then we'll come down and pick it apart. So I'm looking for volunteers to read for us these paragraphs. So, all right, we have 2 volunteers. So we'll start with want to start with verse 2 through verse 4, and Chris 5 through 6, and Dale is 7 through 10. Who will take 11? All right. Mrs. Deacon, you have 11 through 13. Another hand. Mr. Deacon, 14. Oh, you got a big bite. 14 through 19. And we'll put 20 through 24 into a group. Who's that? All right, sir. Roger Moore, former 007 star. 25 is Baba Fella, 25 through 28. 29 is Dale, and she's going to take us right down to 32. Dorothy. What did I say? Dale. Sorry, ladies. Dorothy's going to take us 29 through 32. And who's going to read us home? 33 forward. All right. Now I know you're going to take us home. I hope you all remembered your order. If not, we'll just sort of stare for a while. Read nice and loudly and clearly, and everybody else listen and try to follow. And if they make a mistake, don't laugh at them, cheer them on, and help them out.
Okay.
Read away, sir.
Now then, I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with a great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others.
The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become
and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress.
Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slander many thousands, or slaughter many thousands. Yet he will not remain triumphant, for the king of the north will muster another army, larger than the first, and after several years he will advance with a huge army, fully equipped.
In those times many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision of their success. Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them, but a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be seen no more.
His successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. He will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and the prince of the covenant will be destroyed. After coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully, and with only a few people he will rise to power. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them and will achieve what neither his fathers nor his forefathers did. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses, but only for a time.
With a large army, he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south. The king of the south will wage war with a large and a very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plot devised against him. Those who eat from the king's provisions will try to destroy him. His army will be swept away, and many will fall in battle. The two kings, with their eyes bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other, but to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time. The king's eyes, the kings of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his eyes will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country.
At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastline will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and venture
join them. Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the end of the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time.
Wow. Wow. Now, can anyone tell me, show of hands, what the punishment was for prophesying falsely in the Old Testament? Death by stoning. Very agonizing, torturous death. Now, if you were going to prophesy and you weren't really sure, you'd probably want to talk in fairly general terms. You know, so it could, well, what I know I said that, but what the cracking of the cup really means is that it's the cracking of a large stone over here, you know. You can play with it a bit. But Daniel, this is like reading a history book, isn't it? It is precise. It is direct. It is marriages and intrigue and wars and battles. It's history. And it was written with such precision that this was the main part of Daniel that was used to discredit the book. This was the main part. Chapter 11 was said, there's no way, we don't believe in God, so therefore some human being had to know history, wrote this, and then inserted it in to make it look like Jesus is the Messiah who's going to come and solve all the world's problems. Problem is, again, that it shows up prior to Jesus in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so what we have here is the most, and this is without, and this is not with exaggeration or hyperbole. This is the most detailed prophecy in the Bible. More detailed than Revelation, more detailed than Ezekiel or Isaiah. This is detailed piece of biblical prophecy ever written. And it causes unbelievers to be convinced. There's one testimony I saw on YouTube where a man said that he came to Jesus Christ by reading this. Now you're going, he read that boring piece of history that we just read about kings and everything, but he knew history. And he said, there's no way there's no God in heaven if this was written that precisely, because I know history, and that's exactly how things went down. So he came to Jesus Christ. As prophecy is one of the greatest tools we have to show that the Bible's authentic. If what we now have as history, which was once prophecy, we can look back and go, yeah, look at the precision. What does that say to you when we look forward to things that haven't happened yet? And people go, oh, that's never going to happen, or that's outlandish, or that's silly, or how could that ever happen? And even in my day, since I was a little boy sitting in the pew listening to my Uncle Geordie Archibald preach about the coming of the Lord, the things that have happened in the world that have shaped the world toward world governance, toward world communication, toward every eye beholding him, toward the coming of Jesus, the breaking down of the Iron Curtain and the pulling down of Russia and China toward the middle, all that is happening today just is mind-boggling what has happened just in my generation. And so we are seeing what is now prophetic for us becoming history every day, just like this. So just a quick review from chapter 2 to get us started, because some of you jumped in back a ways, and I just want to take you back to King Nebuchadnezzar, all the way back to King Nebuchadnezzar, and he was the king of Babylon, when Daniel was just a boy and came over in chapter 2. By the time we get to chapter 11, Daniel is an older man. He's lived most of his life in Babylon. But in chapter 2, he's still just a teenager. And you remember the story how the king Nebuchadnezzar has this incredible dream that disturbs him very much. He wakes up, but he can't remember the dream. And then he calls for all of the various sorcerers and astrologers and scientists and people from all the realm to come. But they're not only to interpret the dream, they have to tell him what his dream was, because he forgot his dream. And just that it upset him, and he can't remember, so he just, because he's a despot and he can do this, he just says, well, I'm going to kill you all. Thanks. And he's about to dispose of them all, and they arrive at Daniel's home, and Daniel says, what's going on? Because I guess he wasn't invited. And they said, well, you're going to have to be killed because you didn't interpret the dream. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. So they told him, he said, well, let myself and my friends pray. We're going to pray, and we'll interpret this dream. I love it. And so they prayed, and God gave him the dream. Not only did he give him the dream, he gave him the interpretation of the dream. And so then he goes to Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, great king, this is what you saw. And what the king saw was a great statue, and this picture depicts it, of a golden head, a silver thorax, a brass waist, and then iron legs breaking down into iron and clay feet. And he goes on to explain to King Nebuchadnezzar that these represent kingdoms, and those kingdoms, except for Babylon, which is the golden head, don't even exist yet. But they will exist. And they will have these characteristics. So he describes Babylon, which comes into fruition and exists from 612 to 539 BC. He describes Medo-Persia, which takes place from 539 to 331 BC. He describes Greece, which takes place from 331 to 168 BC. He then describes Rome, which is 168 BC to 476. It lasted over 1,000 years. And then the 10 kingdoms, or 10 toes, which are the outflow of the revived Roman Empire. And so today, the reason I wanted to review this is because what we are going to do tonight is, as we come into chapter 11, the head is gone, right? Babylon is gone. So you don't need to cut it off, but you can pretend it's gone. And as we enter, we are entering into the Medo-Persian period of time. So this history, chapter 11, where you began to read, starts in the chest. And it will go all the way down into the legs. And what's happening as we get further down is that you're going to have the Medo-Persian Empire begin to wane, and the Greek Empire flash suddenly and be very prominent, very quick, and over and wane. And as it's waning, in the midst of that will up come the Roman Empire. So we got a lot of work to do. It's history. If you're not into history, it's going to be more difficult. If you're into history, you're going to be lapping at the dish. But if you're not into history, I want you to look at the precision. Think of the precision in which God is dealing with this. But also think of this. The work that God does to make one thing happen. You know, you say, you've heard of the butterfly effect. a butterfly flaps its wings in Asia and there's a hurricane eventually in Central America. Well, this could be said true of all of these things. A marriage over here, a death over here, a situation that occurs over here, but God is using that, raising that person up to do this, to do this, to do his bidding, but it's all leading to Jesus Christ. It's all leading to the Messiah. It's all leading to Israel. And most of this is happening outside of Israel, and yet it's all about Israel. So think of it in these terms. Look at our big world we live in. It's a big world. Trump is overseas, and he's in North Korea. He's in China. He's talking all of this stuff, and Russia's involved. And you know that all of that has something to do with something that's going on in Israel, right? It's all building toward that. I was watching, I think it's called the Intellect Channel or something. And anyway, it's about like it's all lectures about the political scientists. And these political scientists are saying, what happens? They're not saying what could happen. They're saying, what happens when United States becomes number 2? Because, as I was saying last week, it's going to pretty soon be succumbed by China. What happens when things get flipped around and the dollar goes down? So on. So the world's getting ready for some pretty spectacular things. So as you see this history tonight, don't get all bored. Think, wow, if God's doing things like that back then, what is he doing now? Okay? And I'll do my best to throw as much into it as I can to keep you awake. All right. So by the time we get to chapter 11, Daniel has fulfilled the golden head. Babylon, we've come and go, and now we're in the middle of Persia. So verses 2 to 35 deals with the precise detail of that futuristic but now proven period of history. And it's going to culminate. There's a few names that you need to want to remember out of all of this. There's a few names you're going to want to remember. How many of you have heard of the man Alexander the Great? Okay. He's going to be mentioned here. And how many of you have heard of Antiochus Epiphanes? Some of you have, some of you haven't, because he's not as well known historically, but biblically he's very important because he is a type of the Antichrist. So let's get down to it. Verse 2, I'm on page 5. I've bolded the text. I'm going to read verse 2. Now then I tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. And when he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Now, here's what actually happens in history. That's the prediction, right? Here's what actually happens in history. There are 4 Persian rulers in addition, because we know that Darius is already on the throne, because remember in chapter 10, it was the first year of Darius's reign. So Darius is already there. And so it's later Persian rulers than him. And then we know that as Persia, like any of these countries begin to disappear, their emperors aren't that important. So what we're talking about are 4 major Persian leaders in the middle, somewhere between the building up of Persia, its zenith, and its decay. And so 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and and then a fourth. And that is the future. The prophecy came to Daniel in the 3rd year of Cyrus. So we know that Cyrus is not one of them because Cyrus is already named. And so who are they? Well, I've listed them for you here. Cambius, who was 529 to 522. He is not mentioned in the Bible anywhere. Pseudo-Samaritus, he's not mentioned in the Bible anywhere. But then Darius the First, Hypathipes, and he reigns till 486 BC, and he's spoken of in Ezra 5 and 6, because as you get into the book of Ezra, you start to have Israel start to be reborn. Remember Daniel praying, "Oh God, bring back the people." So as that silver chest moves down in age, you get the development of Israel. Israel starts to be repopulated. How was it depopulated? Through the head Babylon. But God had promised even before there was a man named Cyrus that Cyrus was going to bring the people back in, and Daniel had prayed for that. So that's the near fulfillment of Daniel's prayer. And so then you have Xerxes, who is definitely mentioned in the Bible in Ezra 4 and 6. And I want to make notice of Xerxes because we see these 3 kings as they're identified. They follow a chronological order, and I've put the chronological order there, culminating with Xerxes 1. And Xerxes 1 is infamous. Now, what's famous mean? Well-known, great. What's infamous? Well-known for being bad, right? It's just the opposite. And Xerxes represented, on one hand, the pinnacle of Persia. It was under Xerxes that Persia was as great as it was ever going to get. However, on the other hand, it's the beginning of its decay. Why? Because he did something, and this is really interesting. And you say, you don't usually only get excited about Bible when you get that voice going. But history can be interesting too, how God uses things. And he takes Xerxes, and Xerxes gets all big-headed and says, "I'm the king of the world. I'm going to go down there and beat up on Greece." So he goes down and attacks Greece. But he fights poorly, and all he ends up doing is ticking Greece off and waking up a sleeping giant whose son will arise and be known as Alexander the Great. So Xerxes inadvertently causes Greece to spread from Europe to Asia. Now, all of this, if you want to go a little deeper, if this isn't going over your head, remember that most of the Babylon is Middle East and Asia. Most of Media-Persia is Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq. I'm using modern terms. Some of it down into Syria and Israel, some into Egypt. But it's not over in Europe at all. Europe is developing totally apart. So you got all that great language and philosophy and education in that you read about in Greece, Aristotle and all. But that's all happening over there, and there's no intermix between Europe and Asia because Asia's remaining strong and it doesn't go over and bother Europe, and Europe doesn't come bother them. But Xerxes does something. Xerxes decides, I'm going to invade Europe. And he poked the bear. And he really brought about the demise of Iran, modern day Iran or Persia. Persia was a great country in its day and a great nation, but it was. So according to Daniel, the climax of Persian rulers is Xerxes I, who in secular history used his riches and period of some 4 years to gather a great army. Now, it takes him 4 years to put an army together, and he takes amounting to hundreds of thousands. Now, I'm not a militarist, but we have military strategists here, and Larry, that would be a lot of logistics, would it not? Hundreds of thousands, and it's one of the largest armies ever put together in the ancient world. And they're not in Humvees. They're not in planes. They're on camels. They're on donkeys. They're walking. They're on horses. And how do you create the supply line if you can't picture it in your mind? Flip over to page 6. Now, this is really a map I put together for Alexander the Great, but we can do it in the reverse. And if you go to that map on page 6, right in the right-hand side, find Persia. Have you found it? Okay. Now, go west or follow the line toward the Mediterranean Sea, and you'll get, do you get up in the Mediterranean Sea, you'll see that area like looks like a horseshoe with a lot of little islands in it. Pardon? Yes, that's Greece. Now, if you were going to fly from Persia to Greece today, that would be about 8 hours in a major airliner. If you were going to walk, you're probably going to die somewhere in the desert. And talk about taking hundreds of thousands of men from Persia, and they're not staying at the latest Holiday Inns, all the way over to Greece. And when you get to Mediterranean, you have to get off the land and take ships. That's not cheap. Wars cost money. Just ask George Bush. The United States debt tripled in the last 20 years. So this was very costly. Think of taking all of them, those men, your best young men out of your country who are not going to be educated, they're not going to be procreating, they're not going to be farming. You're robbing your land and you're taking them with you. And he takes them over there. And he launches this in 480 BC against Greek, and it was a disaster. And Xerxes never recovers. Now, it's interesting that in Esther chapter 1, there's this king named Ahasuerus. Most biblical scholars believe that Ahasuerus was Xerxes I. So you get the Bible tie in there. Most biblical scholars believe that the man who's identified as Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, chapter 1, is this historical man named Xerxes I. Because there's different names given to these kings. And so this is kind of interesting that this is the king that we're talking about. And it is ill-fated expedition against Greece that may have occurred between chapter 1 and 2 of Esther. So if you're reading Esther and you read about this king and what goes on in chapter 1 and 2, it's probably right there. So I love when history intersects with the Bible and the Bible intersects with history and go, oh, there it is. So Daniel doesn't get into much about Persian Empire. Why? Because they're already covered adequately in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and they relate to peoples of Israel and the plan of God. And there are records augmented by the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So there's a lot of information. If you're interested in Media Persia, you don't need the revelation that Daniel got on that because it's already been revealed through many other books. But there's a period of time. Have you ever heard of when the Bible goes silent? It's a period of time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And things go quiet between the time of Malachi and the time of Matthew, if you will. But in that period of time, this vision that Daniel has covers that time. So the first part of it, this 4 kings, they're mentioned, and yes, you can find them in other places in the Bible. But when we get into what happens after Alexander the Great, these details are not readily available in the Bible, but they're readily available in history. Now, there are books, we call them pseudo-demographical. Pseudo means false, and demograph means name. Falsely named books that are in the Jerusalem Bible. Oh, you have a Jerusalem? No, that's what does that say? Jeremiah. Oh, cool. There is a Jerusalem Bible. The Jerusalem Bible is a Roman Catholic Bible. Comes out of the Douay version. And they have the Maccabeans in there. Because the Maccabeans were actual people. They were the kings of Israel during that period of time. And there's a lot of history in the Maccabeans. But and I'm not saying that some of it's not accurate, but what we say is that it's not up to the caliber of the Word of God. Do you understand what I mean? It doesn't qualify as the Word of God because it contains human thought and things in it that aren't of God. So the Bible as we have it is very silent during that time. Okay, this is hard work, but is everybody with me so far? Is there anybody has a comment or a question so far? Sonia, how you doing? Plugging along? All right. I can see your nails digging into the table down there.
It's like unreal. It's inspiring.
Oh, good. 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 How are you doing today, Enya? Enya. Aida, sorry. There was a beautiful singer, Enya. All right. Let's go on to verse 3. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. 1 verse, but it is Alexander the Great. There's nobody else that fills this bill. He is a great king that arises, and he does as he pleases. By the age of 32, he says, I've conquered the entire world. There's nothing left to conquer. And if you look at that map, which we just used a few minutes ago to go halfways, imagine he started in Greece. He took Mesopotamia. He takes modern-day Egypt. He takes Israel, Jordan, Syria, I'm going to name modern countries that you can identify with. Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, all of the Arab Emirates. He goes as far as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and into India. Imagine today a country that ruled, if there was a country in the Middle East that big, they would control all the oil. Right? There's no country that big. That stretches from India to, I flew that flight just shy of that from Holland to just a little beyond that. So 17 hours in a 747. That's a long ways. And this man did it by using militarism that had never been seen before, and they still study his militaristic. Although his military might was amazing, his personal life was a wreck. And so remember the goat in Daniel chapter 8 that became very great? That's him. The goat became very great. At the height of his power, the large horn gets knocked off. So the goat is Greece, right? The Greco Empire. But the large horn is Alexander, and it gets knocked off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So the expression in verse 4, after he has arisen, can be translated, well, he was growing strong. So while he was still at his strength, he was only 32, he was still powerful, he could have went on to China. But God cut him down because God had a purpose. You're going to see as we go on that Alexander the Great was used to bring Europe into Asia and to bring Asia into Israel and Egypt up into Syria. He was used to really diversify the Middle East. And it's out of his creation of this new empire that's very quick, very sudden, very fast. Remember how it's his empire is the waste, the speed, and in the other one he's the lion, he's the tiger, and he's running about very quickly in the other vision, devouring things. So the goat becomes great, but his height of power he loses, and it's broken off into 4 winds of heaven. Now, that is literally fulfilled in his kingdom, because when Alexander the Great dies, not only is his kingdom divided 4 ways, but it's divided among 4 generals. And you're going to recognize some of these names in a minute. But he was a bisexual, mainly homosexual preference, but he wanted to have children because that's how you pass on your thing. So he had relationships with women. And Alexander the empire was not given to his posterity because his son Hercules was at the time of his death, whose mother was Barsina, was murdered by a conspirator. And then young Alexander Jr., who was born after Alexander died to his mother Roxana, was murdered in 310. So both his sons were killed. And as a result, the empire of Alexander the Great, after it fell into the hands of 4 generals, and they don't preserve the glory and power of Alexander's day, the strong central rule which had characterized and passed with the death of Alexander. And this event is recorded in Daniel's prophecy, written 539 BC, and was fulfilled when Alexander dies in 323 BC. So if you could predict what the stock market would do in September of this year, you could buy your own private island, right? But Daniel prophesies with exactness that this man would reign, his horn, he would die, and then 4 generals would arise, 4 winds, 4 leaders would arise. He prophesies that over 200 years in advance with that kind of precision. And so this next little map shows you the division of Alexander's kingdom. Now, if you're good with geography, you'll see it here pretty easily. If not, let me just help you. Now, the picture isn't the same as the picture on page 6. It's reduced and moved over to the left a little bit so that because the kingdoms over in India and Pakistan aren't relevant anymore. So Greece is now under the power of Cassander, and Mesopotamia, Turkey, or Asia Minor as it's known in the Bible, where Ephesus, Laodicea, those 7 churches are, is known as Lysimachus. And then in what is now modern day Iraq, Syria, is under the general Seleucus. And then Egypt is under the rule of Ptolemy. How many have heard of Ptolemy? There's a few of you. Yeah, very, very more famous one of these grand generals. So, what has happened now, what happens now with the dissolving of Alexander's great one big empire that just is like a flash in the pan. It's there, it's not there, and then it's there, and then it's not there. You have 4 separate empires now out of 1. But the 2 that we are going to concern ourselves with during this next 300-year period of history that affects the coming of Jesus Christ and affects the Bible very powerfully is the battles between the Ptolemies and their children and the Seleucids and their children. So in verse 5, well, let me stop. Verse 4. We've done 2 verses. How are we doing? We went through two empires pretty quick. But everybody with me? All right. Verse 5. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be great dominion. Okay. I want to change a word for you. Whenever we use the word king of the south, I want you to think Egypt. And whenever we use the word king of the north, I want you to think Syria. Now, Egypt, some Bibles use Egypt, but some Bibles use king of the south. But why don't Bibles refer to Syria in Daniel's day? Always the smartest in the class right here. Syria didn't exist. So how could Daniel say, the king of Syria when there wasn't any Syria. Nobody would know what he's talking about. But that's the king of the north. And the solutions were in Syria. And I'm telling you, Syria is going to play a big role in our future. And what have you heard in the news? Tell me, what nations do you think are involved in Syria right now? Russia, United States, Iran, China, France, Turkey, Canada, Israel, Cuba. You name a country that's not interested in Syria. Russia wants to put a pipeline up through there. No, Syria is very, 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 and it's right beside Israel. And it's going to play a big role in getting Russia down, already has, big role in getting Russia down to the Middle East. So, isn't it interesting that stuff that was going on 300 years before Jesus in these little battles is affecting us today? Because those nations that are being formed like embryos at that time by these kings and being carved up are what's making our nations what they are today.
Oh, I was going to ask you, what did they used to call the area of Syria?
Well, that was remember how Babylon controlled it for a while, and then it was controlled by Media Persia, so it would have been under those areas.
Okay.
Yeah.
So part of Media.
Yeah, part of Media Persia. So beginning in verse 5, the struggle between the various kings of the south, that's Egypt, and the kings of the north, that's Syria, begin and are followed by Daniel in his prophecy all the way from the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 175 to 164 BC, a period of 150 years. So what we are going to get into, folks, is 150 years of history, and very detailed history. And so in verse 8, the king of the south is identified as Egypt. Syria is not mentioned by name at the time because of Daniel's writing. There was no nation existing at that point. Would be confusing. In the tracing of the struggles between Egypt and Syria, the prophecy is selective, and not all the rulers are mentioned, but usually the identification is clear. I just want to say that when a prophecy occurs, it's not meant to tell you, okay, here is the history of this land. What is the purpose of this prophecy? Why did the angel come and begin to speak to Daniel when he's praying? Why did he have the vision? This is important. I want you to think about this because it's really important to understand why we're doing this. To talk about the future, but what about the future? That's it. The rebuilding of Israel. Because Daniel's been praying. But for 12 more points, Colin, the rebuilding of Israel once, and the rebuilding of Israel a second time. And so what we're having is an acting out of near and far fulfillment, a type that we need to see. And so he's not going to give you every detail and every king and every uncle and every niece and nephew and every illegitimate child. You can watch the Game of Thrones if you want that kind of foolishness. But what he's giving you is a selective path through this history to see how Antiochus Epiphanes gets to the place of power where he does what he does, which prepares the way for the spirit of Antichrist. All right? So it was really good that we stopped and asked the question again, why are we here? Why are we listening to this? Why are we going through all this interesting history? Okay, so I'm on the top of page 8. I tried to put pictures in. I don't have any crayons, and I could. Well, that's what we should. You know what we should do? We should have some like black